Okay. Last time we finished, you talked about an episode about the Indonesia funding, which some of the U.S. government officials tied to their prerogative to be able to influence what was happening in Indonesia. So, how did your interest in Indonesia in the 80s transition into the interest in Indonesia today? What was the why do you keep being interested in Indonesia? What's the main point?
Well, the project started in a completely different way. I was sitting in my office at Harvard one day, and I was told that somebody from Indonesia wanted to come and see me. And the gentleman who came said that he represented a group of Indonesians who had been trained in the US and who had returned to Indonesia to find that their ideas were not at all welcome because Indonesia was governed by President Sukarno, who was opposed to the West and who did not want these guys teaching economics because they were teaching the wrong economics. The people who taught economics in the university had all been trained in Moscow or elsewhere in the Soviet Union. So they were in a research academy and they wanted to have some contact with other economists, and especially economists from the West. And they understood that Harvard had an advisory service, and could we provide some advisors to them? So I said I would investigate this, and who would pay for this? And they said the Ford Foundation would pay for it. So I went to Indonesia and set up a small project, and we sent them two advisors, one American, one British. And one day this was in 1962, and one day in 1964, a truck drove up to the residence of the British advisor, and a whole bunch of men came out of it, and the chief of this group of men went in and saw our British advisor and said, "Please, you and your wife step outside into the street." And he said, "Why should I do that?" And he said, "I would advise you to step into the street." So that sounded pretty ominous. And they stepped into the street, the advisor and his wife. And the men went into their apartment and took out all the furniture and the books and so on, and piled it on a big heap in the street and set it afire. And this was part of confrontation between Indonesia and Britain about the fate of Malaysia and Singapore. And so we decided the time had come to leave. After we had worked for 2 years with this group of Indonesians, and the Ford Foundation also decided to leave. It was becoming impossible, obviously, to work under these circumstances. So we ended the project, and
when did you end this? In which year?
1964. Interesting story about how I said goodbye, but I don't want to go into that because you have other things to talk about. So 2 years later, Sukarno had been overthrown. The military had taken over, and the people we had worked with all became ministers in the new government. They basically took over all the economics ministries. And this was called the Berkeley Mafia because most of them had studied at Berkeley, the University of California, Berkeley. And they were now ministers, and they asked us to come back to advise them now. We had been advising them when they were doing sort of abstract research. Abstract because nobody paid any attention to it. Now they were suddenly in power and managing the government's economic affairs. And they asked us to come back as advisors to work with them on dealing with the very difficult problems that Indonesia had, because the country was, the economy was totally in disarray. The official exchange rate was 90 rupiah to the dollar. If you changed your dollars in Hong Kong, you got 1,000 rupiah for a dollar. So 90 versus 1,000. So any Indonesian who could get dollars could make a fortune. So if you got an official permission from the government to import something, they would allocate you dollars to import it. And they assumed that the exchange rate was 90 to the dollar. So if you were going to buy, let's say, medicines worth $100,000, yeah, they would sell you these dollars for 9 million rupiah. And you could then go to Hong Kong and with your $100,000, you would buy medicines that you sold in Indonesia for not 9 million rupiah, but for 1 billion rupiah. So you bought the dollars for 9 million and you sold it for 100 billion. So you made a fortune if you got these import permits. So you got them by paying the person who was in charge of them half the profit that you would make. So corruption was widespread. Exports were not handled officially through the official system, in which case you would get 90 rupiah for each dollar's worth of exports. The Navy, to take the Navy, the official Navy, to take these exports to Singapore, and you earn dollars, which were worth 11 times what you would have gotten if you had done it officially. So exports, official exports, which were also taxed, disappeared. Everything was done on the black market. So it was a very distorted system that they inherited.
So Sukarno went down in 67 and the new government formed in 67 or 68.
No, well, actually the whole process began in 65. The military gradually, Sukarno gradually lost power, and Suharto took over the government. And this began in 65, and by 66, Sukarno was already quite weak, and Suharto was quite strong. When the military first took over, they tried to deal with the economy the way you deal with the military problem. You issue orders, yeah? They would say nobody can increase prices because inflation was 1,000%. So they tried to stop it by saying, you cannot increase your prices. Well, all the goods disappeared because people couldn't afford not to increase prices because the value of the rupiah was continuously declining. So in order to import goods, they had to pay more and more rupiah. So they had to charge higher prices. Well, the military forbade them to charge higher prices, so they didn't sell any goods anymore. So the military discovered you just can't issue orders. You need to manage the economy, and they brought in these economists and told them, you try it. And if you succeed, we'll keep you supporting you. And they were very smart. They were very cohesive. It was a great success story. They managed the economy extremely well. And they gained more and more power. And we came in actually beginning in 66, 67. 67 was the beginning of our new project with them in power.
So you're saying many of the economists who were then asked by the military government to come in and advise were Berkeley trained. What kind of economic thoughts did they have? What was their advice? Where should Indonesia head? Was it influenced by Berkeley teaching?
Oh yes, I mean yes, they also realized they had to deal with the reality of the situation. If you had been a classical, neoclassical economist, you would have said, open up everything, just let the exchange rate go where it may. If it's 1,000 rupiah per dollar in Hong Kong, so be it. But that would have raised inflation just tremendously. So they ran a dual exchange rate. By the way, you need to know, I mean, Indonesia is a big country. What it does matters in the world. It's the fourth most populous country. So there's India, China, the United States, and then Indonesia. There are now 266 million people there. And it's the biggest Muslim country in the world. So what happens there matters a lot, not just for Indonesia, but for the world as a whole. So they were not dogmatic. They were very smart. They began with 2 exchange rates, which is not in neoclassical economics. You don't do that. And they gradually moved them together, and then finally they had a single exchange rate much later. That was the biggest problem at first. They got a lot of aid to reconstruct the irrigation system that had fallen apart, and to increase consumer goods production. So they got yarn from Japan, and they got surplus food from the United States, which they used to increase the diet of people. They were exceedingly successful. And our role, they had 2 groups of advisors, one from the World Bank and the other one, us, from Harvard. And our role was very subsidiary. It was to do things they couldn't do or to think things through they didn't have time for. So, for instance, a problem arose because the Indonesia has a minority of Chinese who are very prominent in industry and trade, but who are a minority that is not treated well sometimes, yeah, and that is widely disliked because they are wealthy on the whole and doing well and managing many of the larger enterprises. And it turned out that the production of batik, which is the shirt I'm wearing, that's a batik shirt. The production of batik used to be largely done by ethnic Malays, by people of the majority group in Indonesia. And it had become more and more done by ethnic Chinese, who are also Indonesian citizens, but are a typical persecuted minority, yeah? Mm-hmm. And that was becoming a political problem. And the boss of the Indonesian group of economists wanted to know how come an industry that had been dominated by ethnic Malays, by the majority, had gradually become dominated by Chinese. But he did not know why this was happening and what could be done about it. Mm-hmm. He asked me to investigate because I had the time to do that and he did not have the time to do that. Mm-hmm. So I looked into that and I gave him a report, mm-hmm, which explained why this was happening and that very little could be done about it without discriminating against Chinese, which nobody was advocating. Mm-hmm. Some small things could be done to reduce the political pressure which was being applied in this case. I spent 2 weeks on this. I went to the area where batik was produced and investigated. So that was our role. Yeah. Also,
do you remember the name of the report, or did you turn it into a book?
No, I used it to do an article many years later. There was no time to do academic work while I was in Indonesia, mm-hmm, or while we were working there. We were always fully occupied. Yeah. So later on, I did an article on why ethnic Malays lost the control of the batik industry, but were very successful in Bali, in the batik industry in Bali, but unsuccessful in the batik industry in Central Java, where it had been concentrated. I did that article much later when I was back at Harvard. I think when I was back at Harvard, I can't remember anymore when I wrote it.
Okay. Well, this is detailed enough. I'll try to find it. Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
Yeah, you can find it. It was done, I think, I published that in the Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies, which is published by the Australian National University and is the best journal on Indonesian economics. Very tightly refereed and very well done journal. Of course, the Australians have a great deal of interest in Indonesia since they're right next door. And Indonesia is a much larger country. So as long as the Ford Foundation was financing us, we had no difficulty at all. And we worked closely with the World Bank, which had another advisory team, and we're all working in the interests of Indonesia. Even the World Bank people were not pursuing what sometimes was World Bank dogma, but were looking at this from the point of view of the Indonesians and how they could be most usefully helped by the World Bank. It was a very good working relationship among these three groups, the Indonesian economists. There was one World Bank economist, really only, and our team, which had 6 or 7 people on it. Eventually, the Ford Foundation stopped financing our team because the Ford Foundation changed interests and was no longer supporting this kind of work. Then we had support from various agencies and at one point from the US aid program. And that worked also fine as long as the US aid program left us alone, basically. They understood that it was in the US interest for Indonesia to flourish economically and not to have economic difficulties. So that worked well until President Bush came into power, and Condoleezza Rice, who was then either National Security Advisor or Secretary of State, knew one person in the aid program who she thought well of and whom she knew also from Stanford University. And she asked him what job he wanted. And he said he wanted to be head of the aid program in Indonesia. So he came to Indonesia and he brought with him a program officer who was sort of the senior person dealing with economic issues, who had experience from Serbia, US aid to the Serb Republic when Yugoslavia broke up. And apparently Serbians are sort of rough and ready people, and you tell them what you think and they tell you what they think of you, and everybody is quite frank. And that's exactly the opposite of Indonesia. In Indonesia, you do not tell people directly things they do not want to hear. That is very impolite. And you never say no. So if you ask a 90-year-old lady, do you have any children? She may say, not yet. because she doesn't want to say no. And if you ask your servant, has my car arrived? He will say, not yet. And that can mean, oh, I completely forgot to ask for it and it's not coming at all. Or it can mean it's right around the corner and it'll be right here. But you don't know which of these it means. Because he won't tell you, no, it's not here yet because I forgot about it. Or no, it's not here yet because it hasn't just arrived. He will say not yet. And then you have to pursue it. And he may or may not give you a correct answer because he doesn't want you to hear something that you don't want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
So, so telling people, you cannot do this because I say no, you don't do that. That makes people very upset. And this guy came in and he not only told the Indonesians what they could do, he told us what we could do. And of course, that wouldn't work at all. For instance, he told our advisor at the Ministry of Finance, you must tell the Indonesians they should pay their debt to the United States 1 year early. And the advisor said, how do I explain to them that it's in their interest to pay 1 year early? Of course, it's not in their interest, right? I mean, you want to pay as late as possible if you have a debt. And it wasn't due for another year. So why should they pay a year early? The advisor said, how do I explain that to them? And he said, that's your problem. That's why we pay you lots of money to be an advisor. You figure out how to explain it to the Indonesians, and you tell them it's in their interest to pay us early. Why did he say that? Because then he could brag to his superiors, you see, I've gotten the Indonesians to pay 1 year early. He can hope to be promoted. But I said, when they told us that they would give us instructions and we were to tell the Indonesians what they told us to do, I said, the Indonesians are not stupid. They will very quickly understand that we are no longer working in their interests, we're working in the interests, the short-term interests of the US government. And we will lose all influence. He said, again, he said to me, that's your problem. If you can't do this, we'll get somebody else who can. So that brought our project with the US government to an end because we refused to work under those circumstances. We would have to lie to the Indonesians, yeah? We would have to tell them, this is in your interests, when they and we knew it wasn't in their interests, it was in the interests of this particular guy in the US aid program. In the interests of the US didn't care whether it got paid a year earlier or a year later. These were small sums of money for the US. So it became impossible to work. And the US aid program lost all influence, all appreciation. The Indonesians became quite hostile to the US. And the US did not understand how to work with another government. For instance, after we left, I continued working in Indonesia, and I got a call from the head of the economic staff of the vice president. It was an important position, yeah. And he said, Gus, please do me a favor. I have a proposed advisor from USAID, and she knows nothing about Indonesia, so I have to educate her. She asks me all sorts of questions, and I've already spent 2 hours with her. And I can't spend any more time. Please do me the favor and talk to her for 2 hours also. I'm asking all of my friends to each take 2 hours to tell her about how Indonesia functions. Will you do that? And I said, yes, of course. He had been our student. I knew him well. I knew he had an important job. So I said, sure, I will do this. And I spoke to this lady who knew nothing about Indonesia, who had not read anything about Indonesia, who had just come there, and she was supposed to become an advisor to this man. And so I spent 2 hours telling her about Indonesia, and then I said, and when are you coming back to Indonesia to work? And she said, oh, I'm not coming back to Indonesia to work. And I said, but I thought you were going to be an advisor to this important Indonesian official. She said, yes, of course, I'm going to be an advisor to this official. And I said, how are you going to do that if you don't come back to Indonesia? He said, well, I have no intention of coming to Indonesia. My family she was of Chinese origin, and she had been working for USAID in China, and her family was in China. And she said, my husband and my children are in, I think it was Shanghai, and that's where I will live. And I said, how will you work as an advisor to this man if you live in Shanghai? And she said, oh, that is very simple. He will send me his questions on which he wants advice, and I will write him back my advice. I don't have to be in Indonesia. I can live wherever, and we will do this all by email or Skype. And I talked to my Indonesian friend and said, you know that she's not planning to come to Indonesia to work with you? And he said, yes, I just found that out. And he said, how will this work? And he said, it won't work at all. I will tell AID I don't want her.
So this was it in the 80s, in the 1980s, in the mid-1980s?
I'm sorry?
Was this in the mid-1980s when this new advisor came in?
I don't remember. When was the first Bush administration?
Yeah, mid-80s.
Yeah, so it was shortly after the Bush administration came in, there came this new could it have been in the mid-80s? I don't.
Clinton came in 93. So the Bush administration was until 93. It was Yeah.
Oh, so then it may not have been at the beginning of the Bush administration. It may have been more like 1990. I would have to look this, I don't know how I would look this up when this happened. Um, it may have been in the second, after he got reelected.
In the Bush or in the Clinton administration?
Hmm?
During the Bush or Clinton administration? Bush.
Yes, well, he got reelected, right?
Yeah.
He served 2 terms.
Okay.
This could have happened in his second term, which would have been then in 1989, 1990, perhaps.
Bush Senior was one-time president, 89 to 93.
89, oh, so yes. So then it would have been 1990 probably or so, when this new guy came in. That's entirely, yeah.
Did this mean a complete change in how economics was looked at, how the Indonesian economy was understood, or was it a gradual change?
No, it was a very rapid change, but only by the US government. Nothing else changed. The Indonesian economy was still largely influenced by the Berkeley Mafia. The World Bank continued to be active and influential. But the US um, they brought in all people who knew nothing about Indonesia. Because they said, you people have been here too long. You think you're working for the Indonesians, but we are paying you, so we will tell you what to do. And when we refused to do that, they brought in people who knew nothing about Indonesia, but who were willing to do whatever they were told by the US to do.
You mentioned, you used the word Berkeley Mafia. Why do you refer to the economists as a mafia circle?
Well, because they were like a mafia. They had a boss, and everybody respected him, like he was the mafia boss. This was not my term. This was what they were called universally by everybody.
Yeah.
And they all paid attention to what the boss of the mafia said. So
who was the boss?
One of them, he was, his name was Wijoyo Nitisastro, and he was very smart, and he was very good at dealing with the president of Indonesia, who was a dictator, yeah? So if you persuaded him, it was done. There was a parliament, but they did what the president said. Wijoyo was a very good economist, very able, but he also knew how to work with politicians. And during the period when Indonesia was having great economic difficulties, he was extremely influential. So he was one I worked with. Because I went to Indonesia in 1970 for 4 years to head the Harvard advisory team. And so I worked with Wijoyo and the World Bank representative. But I worked with Wijoyo in the sense that I did what he asked me to do.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes I would say something to him that he hadn't asked me to do, that I had looked into because they had not had nobody working on it. But on the whole, I did what he asked me to do, and helped him do his job better. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's always the concept that the foreign advisors tell their counterparts what to do when they do that. That is generally not the case.
Mm-hmm.
And if we had tried to do that, we would not have lasted very long.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were the ministers and we were just advisors. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So for how long did the Berkeley Mafia exert influence on Indonesian politics? For how long did they remain in prominent positions?
That's a very interesting question. They remained in prominent positions, but they didn't have always the same influence.
Mm-hmm.
When the economy was doing well, their influence declined.
Mm-hmm.
When the economy was in trouble, their influence increased. For instance, the head of the petroleum company, the government petroleum authority, became very influential. And he did all sorts of things that were not very wise. He set up an airline, which is not a good thing to do because you're competing with well-established airlines, and the only reason he could succeed was by getting a big subsidy from the government. He got into all sorts of businesses using the money of the Petroleum Authority. And he also helped support the president's re-election. And he did things that the Berkeley Mafia didn't approve. But when the price of oil was high, he was riding high, and he got his will, and the Berkeley Mafia was sidelined.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
The price of petroleum dropped, and all of a sudden, all the debt he had incurred to set up the airline and to set up other enterprises were suddenly coming due. Indonesia had big debts that it had difficulty paying because the price of oil had declined, which was at the time its principal export. And all of a sudden, the Berkeley Mafia was put back in charge. They were asked to renegotiate the debt, and they were asked to take over the management of these enterprises that this petroleum czar had set up.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly their influence was again very great. So it went up and down until towards the end of the Suharto government, the influence was very small because Suharto's children were becoming prominent. They were taking advantage of the great power that their father had to take over enterprises. If you set up an enterprise and you failed, that was your problem. If you set up an enterprise and you succeeded, they would say, you need me as a partner. And if you didn't take him on as a partner, you would get into trouble with the tax authority, and the Ministry of Finance would cause you difficulties, and your enterprise would probably go bankrupt because you would have so many problems with the government that you couldn't succeed. So everybody would have to take a child of the president's or a crony as a partner if you were successful. So it became very unattractive to invest in Indonesia, because if you fail, you were in trouble. You had to deal with that failure. But if you succeeded, you would get some of your business taken over by somebody else. And that contributed to the downfall of the Suharto government.
Okay, very interesting information. I don't know much about this until now. I still have to, I have to read myself on this, about this a lot. But if we move to the present, to the contemporary, and you would be back in Indonesia as an advisor, say a new Harvard Development Advisory Service. What would your analysis be of the economy, and what would your advice be in the current scenario?
Now, no, I'm almost certainly not going back as an advisor, except very briefly to present our book, to participate in presenting our book, which we now have to revise, because all of a sudden Indonesia faces a desperate situation. The world is growing much more slowly in the future than it has grown in the past. And it's particularly true of China, which has been Indonesia's largest trading partner. So China used to grow at 10% a year, its economy, for many years. Then it slowed down, but it was still growing at 6 and 7%. And this quarter, it has had a decline in its GDP of 6.5%. So instead of increasing by 6%, it has declined by 6%, 6.5%. So that's a change of 12, 13%. Now it'll recover next quarter. It'll do a little bit better. It'll do better, but it's going to be a while before it's again growing at 6.5%. And the same thing is true of other trading partners of Indonesia. So its exports are declining in price. It will have very much more difficult economic circumstances to deal with. So it has to earn more foreign exchange, but not by exporting more coal, whose demand is shrinking. It has to export manufactured goods. And that means it has to become more competitive in manufactured goods. Why does it have to export manufactured goods? Because it has a large body of surplus workers. is not widely understood, and this is the principal point we want to make if we get a chance to talk to the president. Indonesia has about 20 million workers who are not needed in the jobs where they are in. So why do they have these jobs? Well, because they need to have income. Otherwise, they have no food on the table. So what kind of jobs do they get? Well, if their family has a small plot of land that could be managed by 3 workers, there may actually be 5 family members working there. 2 of them are surplus. They're not needed.
So you're saying this is basically a problem of efficiency and productivity in
Yes.
Indonesia. This is basically a question and a problem of efficiency and productivity.
Well, yes, but it is not something that's anybody's fault.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that there are no other jobs for these people. Yeah? If there were a job in manufacturing for them, they would happily leave the family farm and go work in manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
Manufacturing has been growing very slowly.
Okay.
And the labor force increases each year. So there are more people looking for jobs than there are real jobs available. So people, they're not only working on the family farm, where there used to be 2 people shining shoes at the corner, there are now 4 people shining shoes. They're shining the same number of shoes, but they're dividing the income among 4 people.
So do you see now in the current scenario and with the trajectory that the Indonesian economy and the businesses in Indonesia have had, do you see Indonesia as a good contender for attracting foreign production into Indonesia from, say, China, which seems to be losing manufacturing now?
Well, it has not been a good contender. That has been the problem. Unlike Vietnam, which has attracted a lot of investment from investors leaving China and looking for other countries to invest in, Vietnam has been very successful. Bangladesh has been successful in attracting garment industry. India has been successful in attracting some industry, not much. But Indonesia has not been successful at all in attracting investment in manufacturing. What foreign investment it has attracted has either gone into the stock market or has gone into raw materials. The problem is that producing coal, for instance, or copper or nickel doesn't employ many people. In minerals, $1 billion worth of exports employs 60,000 people. In garments and textiles, $1 billion of exports employs, if I remember correctly, 200,000 people. So more than 3 times as many. Yeah. So if you develop coal, it doesn't employ many people, and 2 million people are added to the labor force each year, and only about 600,000 or 700,000 of those find real jobs. The rest either go abroad, which is a small number, or become surplus workers in Indonesia. So you have to put these people to work. And in order to do that, Indonesia has to compete in the world market. And it has not been successful in doing that. And it has not been very successful in attracting foreign private investment. And why it hasn't been successful is somewhat complicated. It's because its labor costs are very high, even though it has a lot of workers who are producing nothing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And who would be better off if they were, for the country, if they were working in manufacturing and producing real goods that can be exported.
Mm-hmm.
But the labor costs in manufacturing are high.
Mm-hmm. So the Indonesian government will only be able to do something long-term about this. There's not going to be any change in this scenario for the short and mid-run.
No, they have to. If they don't do anything, now the situation will get worse because the world market will be shrinking, or at least not growing as rapidly as in the past. And so they have to deal with their problems of high costs, or they will be left out of the future investment that is taking place in other countries as it moves out of China. I think there will be less investment now in China because of the risks that have been shown to exist if you have China as part of your supply chain. Yeah. So the movement out of China will be accelerated.
Mm-hmm.
And if Indonesia doesn't capture some part of that, it will be in long-term trouble. So it needs to act, take the steps that make Indonesia competitive in the world market. And that is our basic message. At 5% growth rate, which has been the growth rate in the past, large groups have been left behind, have not benefited from growth. And that has resulted in these groups being resentful. But in the future, if they don't change some policies, they will not grow at 5%. They will grow at less than 5%, and the groups that left behind will be larger, and that will cause political problems in a country that is extremely important in the world picture because of its size and its religion.
Mm-hmm.
So
Very good. Mm-hmm.
So
good, you're making a call for this. I mean, it sounds quite relevant, quite important.
Yeah, it will not be easy to do this. They will have to find ways to make the cost of labor to investors lower without lowering the income of workers.
Mm-hmm. What do you think as an economist, how can they do that?
Well, yeah, there are various ways of doing it. First of all, they can lower other costs than labor costs. Yeah. So that doesn't reduce the income of workers, but it increases the overall costs of manufacturing. And the biggest other cost they can reduce is the cost of infrastructure. Indonesia has very high cost power, and very unreliable power. So many factories have standby generators. And that's very expensive because they run on diesel fuel and they are inefficient because they're small. The transport system is high cost because trucks often operate at 20 kilometers an hour. So you need 5 times as many trucks as you would if they were operating at 100 kilometers an hour. Yeah. And they operate at 20 kilometers because there are holes in the road. So if you fix the infrastructure, the total costs will come down without lowering the cost of labor. Secondly, the cost of labor is high in part because the costs of goods and services which workers buy is high. Indonesia has high cost rice. Why? Because its rice price is well above the world market rice price. So Indonesia has cheap rice, therefore it can have low wages, and the workers are still well off because they buy rice at a low price. The Indonesian rice price is 50% higher. So workers need 50% more in wages in order to buy the same amount of rice. Okay? That's true not only of rice, it's true of many foods that workers buy. So why is that the case? Because there are controls on the import of rice, of wheat, of garlic, of onions, of soybeans, and the people who get permission to import have a high profit, which they share with those who get them permission to import. So there is a food mafia which is benefiting from the gap between the price in the world and the price in Indonesia. And that raises the cost of food to workers, and as a result, they raise their wages, putting pressure on the government to keep raising the minimum wage, which in Indonesia is higher than in all other countries in Asia. So our recommendation is you lower the price of food. That enables you to stabilize the wage, so as it rises in other countries, if it doesn't rise in Indonesia, you become more and more competitive. Okay. You also need to devalue the currency, which is already taking place now. But you need, when you devalue the currency, that raises the cost of imported goods, right? But you can't have that happen for the goods which workers buy, which means mainly food, because otherwise the wages will rise over 18 months to catch up with the higher price of food. Well, you can do that by stopping the profits of the food mafia. Okay. So, in addition, the government can lower the price of other goods that workers buy For instance, transportation. Workers spend a lot of money taking buses from where they live to where they work. If you subsidize transportation for workers going from home to factory, then the same wage will buy them more transportation or would save them money on transportation, which they can spend on other things. So you could make a deal with the workers that you don't raise their minimum wage, but you lower the price of goods which they buy, and it has the same effect as raising their wage, yes?
Mm-hmm.
If instead of raising their wage from 100,000 rupiah to 120,000 rupiah, you lower the price of goods they buy from 120,000 to 100,000, it's the same effect.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the approach that you need to take. And it's entirely feasible. It's a little bit difficult. These are not simple things to do, to break the hold of the food mafia, to import, but you can import rice at a much lower price by letting it come in freely.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can stabilize the wage and make Indonesia more competitive. Now, that is not what is, at the moment, Indonesia is dealing, like every country, with the immediate crisis of workers losing jobs and factories and businesses, other businesses shutting down, and exports earning less income. They're dealing with that in the very short term by providing extra income in a variety of ways. That we're not addressing because it's too late. They've already done these things, the very short-term things. But what we're saying is, if they don't tackle the longer-term problems, these short-term problems will continue to get worse and worse.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we are addressing.
Very interesting. Very, very good. I think this is really, it took an unexpected turn, the information you gave me from what you're working on from the manuscript. I wasn't aware that this would be your advice, but I think that's really very interesting. Also, in comparing this with, say, Vietnam, India, and maybe South Korea in the region as other economies which have attracted manufacturing from China in the past or who might benefit from this.
Indonesia is not competing with South Korea. South Korea is by now well along the chain of complications of the kind of manufactured goods they produce. I mean, they're producing cars, right?
Yeah.
From scratch. And they're exporting cars. They're competing in the car market. Indonesia may be producing small bits of car parts.
Mm-hmm.
But what it needs to expand is the labor-intensive goods that can employ these 20 million people.
What would be an example of a labor-intensive good?
Well, it's toys, it's electrical and electronic parts, it's car parts. They are producing car parts. They need to produce more car parts. Mm-hmm. They can produce tires. They can produce the wiring systems that go into the dashboard. They can produce cycles, bicycles. They can produce kitchenware. They can produce a whole host of manufactured goods. But the biggest field in which they could compete is garments and textiles. But another element in our recommendation is that they need to develop these industries in places other than the Jakarta area. Jakarta is where most of industry is concentrated, but that is the highest labor cost in the country. The labor cost in central Java is much lower, but you can't have industry there because there's no infrastructure. So government needs to put in the infrastructure that allows industry to move there. Now the problem is I'm supposed to have another call at 4 o'clock.
Yeah, that's completely fine. I think we have gone through all the questions and you have answered them with great rigor. I'm really quite impressed, and this should be very good for my purposes.
Okay, well,
yeah.
Yes.
And if there's any questions, maybe you could allow me to send you an email and clarify by email if there's any questions that I have on stuff I read up or when I listen to the interviews again.
Yes, sure. We can have another very short session if that's necessary.
Yep.
But not for a bit of time because I have to catch up.
Yep, I understand completely. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this interview.
Okay, you will send me the reference to it also, please.
Sorry, the reference to?
The URL for, is it the same? It's the same
yeah.
the one you sent me before. Okay.
I will, for sure. Yep.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. And have a good Sunday and good luck on your book. And I hope I can meet you in Boston at one point if this crisis resolves. I'm planning to go either the summer, autumn, or early next year, depending on what's possible and not.
Yes. Well, at the moment, I couldn't meet you even if you were here.
That's true. Yes. So let's hope this resolves swiftly. Thanks a lot, Gus.
It'll take a while, I fear.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
I want to make one stop before my 4 o'clock call.
Okay, very good. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.